I'm Reverend Paul, and today we're looking at a question a lot of people carry quietly, but almost never ask out loud. Is your marriage still a marriage in God's eyes? Scripture actually gives us a direct answer to that, and I want to walk through it with you verse by verse because I think you deserve a real answer instead of a guilt trip. Let's start with what marriage even is, because you can't talk about when something breaks until you know what it was built on. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, it says, "A man leaves his father and mother and holds fast to his wife, and the two become one flesh." Jesus quotes this directly in Matthew chapter 19, verse 6, and he adds something important. What God has joined together, let not man separate. That's the foundation. Marriage, in the biblical sense, isn't a legal contract or a shared lease. It's a covenant, a binding, sacred union that God himself is a witness to. In Malachi chapter 2, verse 16, speaking through the prophet Malachi, God says he hates divorce because it represents a covenant being torn apart, not just a relationship ending. If you're finding this helpful so far, go ahead and tap that like button. It helps more people find this video when they're quietly asking the same question you are. Now let's get into it. That's a heavy standard, and I think a lot of Christians hear God hates divorce and either weaponize it against people who are suffering or feel so crushed by it that they stay in something Scripture never actually asked them to stay in. So let's look at what the Bible actually says happens when a covenant like this is broken. The first ground Scripture gives us is unfaithfulness. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, Jesus says, "Whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." That word "except" is doing real work in that verse. Jesus draws a clear exception. He's not being casual about marriage. He quoted Genesis 2 and said, "Don't separate what God has joined." But he's also not pretending a covenant survives every kind of violation. Unfaithfulness, in the plain reading of this text, is something that ruptures the covenant itself, not just the relationship's comfort level. Drop a comment below with the question you're actually sitting with on this topic. I read every comment, and I may make a follow-up video answering the most common ones. Jesus only names one exception in that passage, but he's not the only voice in the New Testament on this. The second ground comes from Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He's addressing a believer married to someone who wants out of the marriage entirely. In verse 15 he writes, "If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or the sister is not enslaved." That phrase, "not enslaved," matters. Paul is saying that when a spouse deserts the marriage and refuses to continue it, the remaining spouse isn't bound to chase down someone who has already left. Abandonment and desertion are treated here as their own category, separate from the unfaithfulness Jesus named in Matthew. Now, this is exactly the kind of question I hear most often, quietly, usually not in the main lobby, but in a side conversation, because it feels too heavy to ask out loud. So I put together a free study guide walking through every verse we're covering today with the full references so you can look at them yourself. It's linked in the description and the pinned comment below. I want to slow down on something the text doesn't use the word divorce for directly, but that I believe falls under the same covenant-breaking logic, and that's abuse and ongoing danger in the home. Back in Matthew 19, Jesus is responding to a question about Deuteronomy 24, when Moses permitted divorce. Jesus says Moses allowed that because of your hardness of heart, because of the reality of sin in human relationships. God made provision for situations that fall short of his original design. Many pastors and biblical counselors hold that a spouse being physically endangered or children being unsafe falls under that same principle. The covenant was never meant to be a trap that requires someone to stay in danger. If you or someone you know is in that situation right now, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233, and thehotline.org has a 24/7 chat option. That resource is also in the study guide, and I'd rather you use it than sit with this alone. I want to be careful here because I've seen this used the wrong way too. None of what I just walked through is a permission slip to leave a marriage the moment it gets hard, or boring, or less exciting than it used to be. Scripture's default posture towards marriage is covenant faithfulness, pursuing reconciliation, forgiveness, and restoration whenever it's safe and possible to do so. The situations we just covered are exceptions, not the norm, and they're not meant to be reached for the first time things get difficult. If you're in a hard season, but not an unsafe or unfaithful one, everything in Scripture points towards fighting for the marriage, not exiting it. So here's where the text lands. A marriage, biblically, is more than a piece of paper, but it's also not indestructible by human failure. God's design is one man, one woman, one covenant for life. And Scripture names real, specific situations, unfaithfulness, abandonment, danger, where that covenant has already been broken by one party's actions, not by the other spouse's decision to acknowledge what's already happened. If any part of this touches your own situation, I'd genuinely rather you reach out to a pastor or biblical counselor near you than carry this alone. And if you're in a season where the same fight keeps coming back around, I made a video breaking down exactly why that happens. You'll find it linked right here and in the description. Thank you, and God bless.